Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley, Part 4, Gerald Croft's Interrogation. You need to have read, watched or studied this part of the play before, and as a result you're using this video for revision purposes or to gain a deeper understanding. I'll start by explaining what happens in this section of the play. We'll then explore the key characters, themes, quotes and context together. And I'll leave you with an exam-style question at the end of the video if you wish to answer it and get some writing practice in. So, what happens in the part of the play that I call Part 4, Gerald Croft's Interrogation? Well, for starters, this starts from when Gerald says "what" in a startled manner, and it ends with the stage direction. He goes out, they watch him go in silence, we hear the front door slam. In terms of J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls, this is the end of Act 1 and the start of Act 2, but in terms of my revision series on YouTube, I'm calling it Part 4, Gerald Croft's Interrogation. So, what happens is the Inspector Gould, leaves Gerald and Sheila on stage. So Gerald's given himself away by saying "what." This means he recognises the name Daisy Renton. The inspector leaves, and this leaves the engaged couple, Gerald and Sheila, on stage alone. Now, I've put in parentheses, in brackets, the phrase entrances and exits. This is a dramatic feature that playwrights use by determining the exact moment a character enters a scene or exits a scene, and who is left on the stage and who is off stage. Writers can create tension, which is a fundamental part of any play or drama. So by leaving Gerald and Sheila on stage, and Sheila knows that Gerald was absent for parts of summer and didn't see her, and Gerald has now given himself away, showing that he had some kind of relationship or knowledge of Daisy Renton. By leaving them on stage alone, Priestley creates a lot of tension for the audience because there is trouble in paradise. These two lovers, these two engaged people, suddenly are beginning to realise there are cracks in their relationship. So once the inspector's gone, Sheila actually fills his shoes, and she begins to interrogate Gerald about Daisy Renton. And at first Gerald really didn't want to give much away, but eventually he concedes that he did know about Daisy Renton. And it's at this moment where Inspector Gould returns that Act 1 ends and the curtains fall, and then after an interval, Act 2 begins and the curtains rise on the exact same scene, where Sheila, Gerald, and Inspector Gould are on stage. So at this point, Inspector Gould has returned and starts to interrogate Gerald, and Gerald actually tries to send Sheila away, but Sheila insists on staying and finding out the truth. This is a key idea, that Sheila and the inspector both want the truth. Mrs. Burling enters the stage and she tries to assert her authority over Inspector Gould. Mainly by using the fact that she's a prominent upper-class woman. However, she fails at this. The Inspector Gould just takes no regard of it. He wants to find out the truth. He's going to do his duty and interrogate the Burling family and Gerald Croft. Mr. Burling then enters the scene, and he also tries to assert his authority over Inspector Gould. And once again, Inspector Gould he fails because Inspector Gould isn't interested in their upper class or their wealth or their social influence. He's interested in doing his duty, finding the truth and getting justice for Eva Smith. So once all of this sort of charades of power struggles are over, Inspector Gould can finally start interrogating Gerald Croft. And what Gerald reveals is that he met Daisy Renton. Remember, her name was Eva Smith to begin with, and she changed it to Daisy Renton after she got fired from Burling & Co. and then fired again from Millwood's department store. So Daisy Renton, who is Eva Smith, was in the Palace Music Hall. The Palace Music Hall, contextually speaking, is like a theatre that people in Edwardian England would have gone to for entertainment. And you would have had what's known as a variety act. So that means many acts would come on stage. Some might be singers, some might be dancers, some might be comedians, and you'll be entertained in a variety of acts. And in the theatre, there was sometimes a bar where you can go and get a drink and have a good time. And it was quite commonly known in this particular bar, and maybe in other music halls across the country, that it was frequented by prostitutes, and that's where prostitutes will meet men who have who are out for a good time, to get an entertaining show, to have a few drinks, who might have a bit of spare money, and a transaction for sex in exchange for money can sometimes take place in these venues. And we see that Alderman Megati was hitting on Daisy Renton. I couldn't think of a good verb. I wanted to use the word seducing, but I don't think it's what Alderman Megati does is seducing. So I've used the more colloquial, the more common language, hitting on or chatting up Daisy Renton. Now, Alderman Megati, Alderman is a title, and it's to do with political power within a community. So Alderman Megati is a man who's in a position of social and political influence. And the way he treats women is quite disgusting. He's a notorious womanizer. Sheila gives an account that she had a friend or someone she knew who had an interaction with Alderman Megati, a young woman, and she just escaped with a torn blouse. So Alderman Megati hits on women, probably picks up prostitutes from the palace hall, and he treats them really roughly. He's quite a disgusting individual. So Daisy's in a bit of trouble. She's getting hit on by Alderman Megati. So Gerald, like a knight in shining armour, comes to the rescue. He sends Alderman Megati away, and he talks to Daisy Renton. And he realises that Daisy was hungry. So Gerald took her out of the music hall, where she was probably going to work as a prostitute, because remember, she'd lost two jobs, and making money would have been a huge problem. So she was probably there renting her body, which is a bit of a character name because her name is Daisy Renton. So she's renting her body probably to pay for her rent, so she has some board and lodgings and somewhere to stay and survive. Daisy also being a flower with white petals, and this connotation of innocence and purity sort of being destroyed by the harshness of society, the need to survive, the need to maybe rent out her body to pay rent. So Gerald took pity on her and took her out of the music hall where she was maybe prostituting herself, and took her to a respectable hotel and provided her with food and drink. This is a really nice gesture from Gerald. It turns out Gerald's friend, a guy called Charlie Brunswick, was out of town. I think it was Canada he's gone to. So he gave Gerald some keys to some apartments, and he let Daisy stay in some of Charlie's rooms. Again, a really nice gesture from Gerald, providing not only food but accommodation to Daisy Renton. Gerald went one step further. He even provided Daisy with like an allowance, some money for her to live off, because he realised that she was hard up, she was penniless. And as a result of all of this, Gerald providing food, Gerald providing a room, Gerald providing money, Gerald and Daisy ended up having an affair. Did they love each other? I don't know. You can make up your own mind about that. Was it maybe some kind of way of Daisy Renton thanking Gerald for the food and the accommodation and the money? Maybe. Was there genuine feelings? There's a lot you can discuss about the sincerity, the authenticity of the affair, but regardless of which it happened, Gerald provided Daisy with food, accommodation and money, and in return they had a sexual affair. A little while later, Gerald had to leave town for a business, and he gave Daisy a parting gift of some money and broke off this arrangement. So when he was done, when this was over, Daisy was again left homeless, jobless, and once she used up the allowance that Gerald had given her, penniless, and Gerald's life with Sheila continued as per normal. Daisy took that parting gift of money and spent a couple of months by the seaside to sort of stretch out this moment. She'd met a good guy, Gerald. He treated her well. This was probably as good as life was going to get for her, but it's all come to an end, and she's almost going through maybe a mourning process of losing out from this comfortable situation. After the interrogation, Gerald needs a bit of a break. He says he's more emotional than he appears. having heard of Daisy Renton's passing. And he says he needs to go out for a bit to collect his thoughts. So Sheila gives Gerald back the engagement ring in quite a big gesture to say that this is no longer on. We've both changed as people. We both need to consider what we've done, consider who we are, and start again. And this is a really empowering moment for Sheila, because she's no longer this little girl who does what she's told. She's become an assertive young woman, and she's deciding and shaping her own future. And this is something I think J.B. Priestley wants for Sheila and wants for his post-war British female audience. Gerald then leaves the stage, and we end off part 4, Gerald Croft's interrogation. So the main character to explore here is, of course, Gerald Croft, and I think it's really helpful to look at him in part 1, which I called Sheila and Gerald's engagement. Gerald is presented as the ideal man. He's from an upper-class family, and he runs a successful company, Crofts Limited, so therefore he is rich. The stage directions in the opening stage directions in Act 1 describe him as an attractive chap, a well-bred man about town. So he's good looking, he's rich, he dresses well, he's very good socially, he knows how to talk to people. He really is the ultimate man. However, in part 4, the audience realizes that there are cracks in Gerald's facade. A facade is like a front, almost like a mask you put on. So Gerald has a very good mask. He presents himself as the ideal man. But really, we learn that he has cracks. He has an affair with his fiancée Sheila. He has an affair with Daisy Renton. This is a big crack in his facade. He wants to present as the ideal man, but he has some serious flaws. What I think is that Gerald is complicated, particularly in his interrogation, because initially he helps Daisy Renton. He rescues her from Alderman Megaty's potentially violent sexual encounter. He feeds her when she's hungry. He accommodates her when he realizes she will be without lodging soon. He even provides her money when he realizes she's penniless. And he does all of this for nothing in return. However, in reality, it didn't work out that way. In reality, because of his generosity, it sort of instigated a sort of an attraction, a development of attraction between them, and it resulted in sex, in an affair. But when it suited him, he ended the support given to Daisy Renton and basically rendered her homeless and jobless and without love and support. So he initially comes across as very good with how he treats Daisy Renton, but then almost like an object, when he's done with it, he sort of discards Daisy Renton. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, I think it starts good and then it ends bad. And as a result, this makes Gerald quite complicated. During the interrogation, he neither fully accepts responsibility, or neither does he fully desire to change. And as a result, I think he's neither representative of the older generation, who refuse to accept responsibility, like Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and neither does he represent the younger generation who are willing to change, such as Sheila and Eric. He's kind of like a middle character. He's neither good nor bad, he's neither older nor younger, he's just a little bit complicated. So when I write about him, I would personally get across this idea that he is a complicated character. I want to talk about the theme of exploitation. In previous videos, I've talked about some really big themes such as social class and gender. Today I want to talk about exploitation. So I've got a definition at the top. Exploiting is when you treat someone unfairly in order to benefit from them. So for example, Mr. Burling exploits Eva's labour. Eva Smith can work hard and work well, but he doesn't have to pay her much because she's working class and also working class woman. So Mr. Burling uses Eva's labour to create a product that he charges a lot of money for to make a profit. And in return, he pays Eva Smith very, very little wages for her labour. This is basically exploitation. It's unfair that she gets paid so little, and Mr. Burling makes so much profit. Sheila exploits Eva's social class. So Sheila Burling is middle upper class, Eva Smith is working class. Because Sheila Burling has significantly more money than Eva Smith and spends that money at Millwoods, she's able to use money as a form of power, and this money comes from her middle upper class, and she's able to inflict that upon Eva Smith, who is of working class, and get her fired from her job. That's exploitative behaviour. Gerald Croft exploits Eva for her gender. So poor Eva Smith, she's been exploited for labour, she's been exploited by class, now she's exploited for her gender. Gerald Croft, I think he knows what he's doing. He puts Daisy Renton / Eva Smith in an accommodation, he feeds her, he gives her money. In return, I think he's expecting an affair, which he gets. Later on in the play, we know that Mrs. Burling exploits Eva based on social class, and Eric, rather violently at the end, exploits Eva based on gender. So Eva Smith, who in previous videos we learnt is a characterim to symbolise all working women. So Eva is a reference, a biblical allusion to Adam and Eve, Eve being the first woman, so she represents all women, and Smith being the most common surname in England, maybe even in the British Isles, and that sort of symbolises working class, because a smith is someone who creates something, such as a blacksmith or a woodsmith. So we get the idea that all working class women are being exploited by the higher class. So Eva is a symbol through the characterim of all working class women. On the topic of characterims, we have this idea of Daisy Renton. That's also a characterim. Daisy being a white flower that has connotations of beauty and purity. Everyone who interacts with Eva Smith says she was a pretty woman, a pretty girl. And then we get this idea of Renton, that she's renting out her body as a prostitute to pay the rent so she can survive in Brumley in the Edwardian era. So that technique is called characterim, when a character's name reveals something about their character, their personality. Contextually speaking, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about women and this idea of a fallen woman, and I want to talk about the idea of repression and double lives. Let me explain both. A fallen woman is a woman who's fallen from grace. By grace, we mean good social standing. So let's say maybe you were born as a middle-class woman, you had maybe a job or a husband who could support you, you had kids, life was going well, and then for whatever reason you fell from grace. Maybe your husband died and he was no longer able to provide for you. Maybe you lost your job and you were no longer able to provide for yourself. And as a result, you've turned to other ways to make money, such as prostitution. This sort of woman would be condemned by society. She's lost her good social position and she's been forced into perhaps prostituting herself, maybe doing other sort of acts in order to survive. Thankfully, I use that sort of sarcastically, that word thankfully, some men try to help fallen women. They might try and help them morally by teaching them the Bible and that, prostitution is wrong. They might try and help them learn a skill so they can go back into the workplace and get exploited for their labour. And these men who helped, and I use help in inverted commas as well, because I don't think it's genuine help, these men were celebrated by society. In return, did these men sexually exploit these fallen women? I imagine probably. So what you get in this society is women who are no longer able to support themselves for whatever reason, and they turn to prostitution or other kinds of activities to support themselves. And then you get men who try to help these women by providing maybe an education for a job or maybe a copy of the Bible so they could learn some morality. And these men get celebrated. Does this sound like any characters we know? Eva Smith has fallen from grace because she's lost her job at Burling & Co. and then she lost her job again at Millwoods, and now she's turned to prostitution in order to survive. And this man, Gerald Croft, has come along to help Daisy Renton / Eva Smith, and he gets celebrated for it. Society looks up to him. He gets an affair out of this, and when he's done, he can just discard Daisy Renton and move on with his life. This wasn't an uncommon thing to happen in the Edwardian era. The second thing I want to talk about is this double life. So in England, you have this idea of, I guess, respectability. On one front, you want to present to society that you are a respectable man. For example, you are a good husband, you're a good father, you're good at your job, life is going well, there are no problems. So by putting on this facade, if you remember that word from earlier, this mask that everything is good, sometimes in reality, life is messy, life isn't always good. And you have a side of you that is repressed, that is hidden away. Maybe you want to be wild, but you can't, you have to be a gentleman. Maybe you want to have an affair, but you can't because you're married. So this sort of self-control can be called repression. And this sometimes leads to a double life. So in the other life, some of these gentlemen might commit sins such as using prostitutes, sins such as taking drugs. So on one side, on one of their double lives, they present as really good to society, good husband, good father, good at their job, good civilian, contributes to society. But secretly, they go and have other ways of fulfilling their deepest, darkest desires, such as drugs, drinks, prostitutes. Any characters that sound like this in our play and in Spectacles? You may be thinking of Alderman Meggerty, who is a respectable politician who exploits women sexually and quite violently. You may, on the same topic, think of Eric, who again is a middle upper class man. He has a lot going for him. But because he has to follow in his father's capitalistic footsteps, he struggles to keep up with that facade, and he releases his repression through drink and again through sexual activities, quite violent ones. You may talk about Gerald. Gerald is an upper class man. He seems to have his life set for him. He has this wonderful facade as a good looking rich man, but secretly maybe he wanted an affair and he ended up getting one, and he committed his double life and his double sins as well. So this was a concept that has been used throughout literature and is quite a common theme in different texts, and would have been a common problem in Edwardian era as well. So I've gone through this section of the play and I've picked out some key quotes. Let's take a look at them. Gerald says, "I'm sorry, Sheila." He actually says this 3 times in this section, so clearly he is upset that he's let Sheila down. "So, for God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector." Gerald says this. It shows a bit of naivety. He thinks he can kind of get away with having this affair and it not coming to light. But obviously the inspector knows that it's happened and he brings it to light in front of everyone. "I think Miss Burling ought to be excused." This quote shows that Gerald is trying to get Sheila sort of sent away so he doesn't have to reveal his affair in front of his fiancée. But Sheila insists on staying because she wants the truth. She's becoming empowered as Priestley wants her to. "I know I'm to blame and I'm desperately sorry." Sheila says this. This is a great quote to show how Sheila's willing to take responsibility. "We often do on the young ones, they're more impressionable." Inspector Gould is saying how his socialist message often imprints, is more impressionable on the younger generations, such as Sheila and Eric, compared to the older generations who are more stuck in their ways, such as Arthur and Sybil. Mrs. Burling says girls of that class, so when she's referring to why Eva Smith committed suicide, she says girls of that class she's referring to is the working class. "You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl." Sheila says this. That girl is Eva Smith / Daisy Renton, and the wall is a metaphor, a kind of metaphorical wall between the middle upper classes and the working class. "No, he's giving us the rope so that we'll hang ourselves." Sheila says this. This is another metaphor. So the rope Inspector is giving is the truth, and it's with this truth that the Burlings hang themselves. They wrap the rope around themselves with their own guilt and ultimately hang themselves, hang their own reputations. I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. Gerald says this. You might want to look at these compound adjectives, hard-eyed and dough-faced. This is in reference to the prostitutes who work at the music hall, and contextually, we know that there were fallen women who had to turn to prostitution to survive in this time. And probably between us, we killed her. I would look at those inclusive pronouns, us and we. Sheila's taking not just personal responsibility, but social responsibility for her family's actions. I want you to understand I didn't install her there to make love to her. Gerald says this specifically to Inspector Gould. He's trying to almost defend his integrity, his honour. He's trying to say that he put Daisy Renton in that accommodation, Charlie Brunswick's rooms, for good reasons. He gave her an allowance for good moral reasons, but in reality that did turn into a sexual affair, which sort of undoes his good intentions. Sheila says, quite sarcastically, "You were the wonderful fairy prince." I think this is a nod to fairy tales, where you have a damsel in distress, a woman in need, and clearly Daisy Renton was in need, and you have the wonderful fairy prince ride along, maybe even on a horse, and help the damsel in distress, and they all live happily ever after. Well, Priestley's put a bit of a twist on the classic fairy tale because there is no happily ever after for Daisy Renton. Soon after she drinks disinfectant, and dies. So there's a nod to this fairy tale situation of the upper class helping the working class. But then Priestley shatters this, and this is a fair reflection of society. The upper class doesn't genuinely help the working class. There is no fairy prince in real life for people like Eva Smith. You know it wasn't disgusting. Gerald tries to defend his affair with Daisy Renton when Mrs. Burling calls it disgusting. Is it disgusting? Isn't it disgusting? I leave it up to you. I think the first part wasn't disgusting when he rescued Daisy from Alderman Megati and gave her food and gave her accommodation and gave her money. I think that's all very honourable. I think it probably did become disgusting when in return he was getting sex and having an affair and basically paying for it, which is basically prostitution, paying for a sexual encounter, which I think is what's happening here. I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be. Gerald says this. I don't really know what to make of it. He seems to think he's quite emotionally upset by this, but in reality, when he leaves the scene, he spends quite a lot of time trying to work out whether the inspector was real, and trying to prove he's not real to forget about this whole event. So is he genuinely upset that Daisy Renton died? Maybe a little bit, but I don't think he's that upset by it. I think he might be fibbing here, but that's just my personal take on it. I do like this stage direction. She hands him the ring. It's a bit of a power moment. Whenever I read this in class, a lot of the students gasp, the engagement's over. It's quite a significant moment, and it's quite an easy technique to talk about because it's a stage direction. Okay, you can make notes from this video on a physical copy of the play. I think that's a really good idea. You can also try answering this question. How does Gerald Croft treat Eva Smith / Daisy Renton in An Inspector Calls? I'd structure it with an introduction, a few bodies of analysis, and a conclusion. I personally would argue that some of Gerald's treatment to Eva / Daisy is positive, such as when he rescues her from Alderman Megati, gives her food when she's hungry, gives her accommodation when she's about to be kicked out of her lodgings, gives her an allowance to sustain herself. I think that's all very healthy. That's all very kind. Gerald is quite heroic and treats Eva Smith very, very well indeed. But then I would say it takes a turn from positive treatment to negative treatment when that affair happens and those the sexual side of their arrangement comes into play. And then I would argue maybe it's morally unacceptable, and Gerald Croft treats Eva Smith almost like an object, and when he's done with her, discards her, and ultimately contributes to her downfall and her drinking of disinfectant and ultimate suicide. And then I'll draw a conclusion. Which do I think is more? Do I think he is treating her better, or do I think he's treating her worse? Which one of those sides wins? The good side or the bad side of Gerald Croft? bearing in mind he is a complicated character and you could easily argue both ways. Well, if you like this video, please give it a like. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for the rest of my Anne Spectacles analytical videos, and feel free to leave a comment if you think I missed anything out. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.